Good evening, everybody. I'm Kevin Rogers. I'm the Director of Reasonable Faith Adelaide. And tonight we have Tom Daly, and he's going to speak to us on the implications of artificial intelligence and ChatGPT. So I'll now hand it over to Tom. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, thanks, folks, for coming along. Just for those who don't know me, I've had nearly 40 years in the IT industry, much of it in the Bay Area, in the San Francisco Bay Area, or I guess you'd call it Silicon Valley, where I lived for 5.5 years. And there are some of the technologies we're going to talk about tonight where I was actually involved in some of the very early, incantations of them, the early versions. Not so much the AI, but there's things happening with AI that are building on some of the things that we were working on, both at Sun Microsystems and later at Oracle. Anyway, tonight we're going to talk about we're going to figure out how to advance our slides. That's what we're going to do. There we go. Tonight, I really want to try and just bring us up to date on where artificial intelligence is. And we'll briefly revisit the second of the two talks that I did for Reasonable Faith back in 2018. Talk about where we are today. Really talk about the fears and implications and considerations of the advances that have been made in that 5 years. And then really that's all as the setup for, okay, so what does this mean socially, apologetically? What are the big takeaways? And one of the things that I'd really like to do, particularly for Christians, is to encourage useful responses. So let's get started. I was really surprised when in November a friend pinged me about ChatGPT, a friend from church, a young teacher, and he said, "Wow, Tom, this is just like what you said back in your talk." And I thought maybe that talk was from 2021 or 2020. It was actually 2018 where we first, where we were looking at artificial intelligence here at Reasonable Faith. And just to recap that, I tried to point out that there was good and bad, like all technology, although I remember giving the example of an Exocet missile. There's not necessarily a lot of neutrality about an Exocet missile, right? But I was trying to make the point that the amount of technology that we have is genuinely moral, meaning without morals. It's how we use things for. And I gave you an example of a car. There was somebody driving a car down one of the malls and mowing people down. I think it was in Melbourne. And I said, yeah, the same vehicle could be used as an ambulance to go and pick those people up. Now, we don't think of cars or anything like that as technology. In fact, I once heard a definition of technology is only technology if it was invented after you were born. Think about that, because I think it actually is pretty realistic. Anyway, not to dwell, we covered back in part one just where AI, artificial intelligence, was. And then part two, I tried to address some of the theological, philosophical implications and the worldview that AI was coming into. A lot of that philosophy and a lot of that theology, the theology hasn't changed, obviously, but the environment that ChatGPT and the other AI engines, the chatbots or the large language models, and I'll define the terms as we go, the environment that's been brought into is very different from when we were back in 2018. So just briefly, we looked at some of the economic and social implications of growing AI. We looked at some of the ethics, the use of the AI, and we certainly looked, there's good and there's bad, right? The idea that we can cure diseases, help with climate and ecology, maybe reduce our road toll, specifically with driverless cars, which aren't here yet. Maybe we could ease poverty. There's certainly a lot of assisted living research going on, and there's a lot of AI assisted research. I could give example after example where we're already benefiting in the medical sphere, for instance, whether it's imaging or whether it's bacteria control. Just it's quite amazing how embedded it's already become throughout our day-to-day lives. But there's also the bad too. There's lethal autonomous weapons, replacements for humans, for human times. As you see, we have robot carers increasingly in elderly populations. Sex robots is something that I did follow-up talks about, with the implications for the cybersex landscape, is the talk at Reasonable Faith, the implications for what's happening to our kids. And I'll touch on that again this evening. And then there's all the catastrophic risks. And so that was where we were in 2018. And I presented this picture, and I said, look, there's a lot of talk about AIs killing us and killing us all. And I think that is maybe valid. But I tried to point out in the AI Talk Part 1 that even without awesome advances in AI, the implications of AI were going to, that I had on the previous slide and more, were just going to continue to grow. Now, what I didn't know was that already in 2017, there was something called transformers that had already been created. And they're actually combined all the fields of AI. And we're going to talk about them a little bit more. But the logic here that I use, which is even without cataclysmic breakthroughs in AI, the advances were going to be more than incremental, and they would be very, very significant. If we are here back in 2018, and this line really should be a not a straight line, but actually I've lost the word, an exponential curve. That so we're further down, no doubt. So the point here being that in 5 years there has actually been a heck of a lot of progress. We only really realized it back in November when ChatGPT 3 released, and I started getting calls from teachers saying, what the heck? How are we going to grade papers when ChatGPT can write our papers? It can write essays for our kids. What do we do? And I know you were sick over that time, Bronwyn, but a number of my teacher friends were relaying to me just the amount of anxiety that this was actually causing. So I guess reason for talking in 2018 was in part to try and get the church and our where that's the capital C church, but also as church goers, which a lot of us on this forum are, to get us involved so that we have the tools to explain culture with the gospel to our kids. And I don't think we can do that. In fact, it's become very obvious to me that we can't do that if we don't understand at least a little bit, if we're not conversant with technology. And right now, that means AI. And in fact, AI has grown only more deeply integrated into our society in those 5 years. We talked about things like customer service bots, whether you're talking to Telstra, your motor vehicles, whoever it is, they'd rather have you talk to an automated bot than a human that they've got to pay an hourly rate. But manufacturing and robotics has moved along in leaps and bounds. Agriculture is not immune. Whether it's when to plant, how to plant, or whether it's the use of fertilizers or increasingly mechanized harvesters, or anything to do with actual agriculture is being continually automated. And one of the challenges I had for this evening was what to leave out. So you can read the list. I'm not going to go through all of them. Autocorrect and autocomplete, though, is worth a mention because you're using that all the time. That's AI. It's figuring out what the next word is. It's guessing what the next word is. Keep that in mind as we go, because that's actually pretty much what the chatbots are doing. Hiring and recruiting. I heard a stat that, at least in the US, and I don't know what it's like in Australia, something like about 99% of resumes are now going through an AI hiring process before they get into a pile that somebody might, where somebody might actually talk to them, a human might talk to them. Dating and relationships. It's been interesting sitting at church watching people young people on their dating apps. Parole boards, mortgage, healthcare, self-driving cars is probably the standout. That hasn't actually progressed as fast as we expected. But social media, welfare, ChatGPT, large language models, and natural language processing, we're going to look at those for the rest of this talk. So still considering how AI is integrated, right? Let's just take that example of social media, and you look at the spread of misinformation that we have, fake news, polarization, radicalization, privacy. In fact, I heard a really, really good point. When we were formalizing HTML, the hypertext markup language, which is the language of the internet, we never realized that one day we'd need legislation that enshrines the right to be forgotten. And that's what I think we need to, when I talked about the technology being morally agnostic, right? Amoral, without morals. But it's the implications, it's the downsides of technology that we quite often don't see or don't pay attention to. Social contagions. We know that that the rate of people identifying as transgender or as gender dysphoria was a mere fraction of what it was a few years ago. And there is a general degree that at least some of that is a social contagion. Sexualization, especially of young girls, and this is an area I know something about because I'm working with the universities and Australian police to try and protect some of our kids. Doom scrolling, bots and deep fakes. That's going to be an increasingly dangerous area. Cancel culture and threats to democracy and government. What do I say? Well, you have the QAnon conspiracy theory that leads to people that's online that leads to real world consequences. And in fact, actually what you've got there is quite a humorous thing. I asked DALL-E 2, which is an image generating AI, to draw me an image of police stopping a conspiracy theorist, and that's what it spat out for me. I'm not sure it's the best ever job, but I thought it was a bit of fun to include. They are amazingly better than that now for image generation. And there's a really good book that I've heard discussed a lot, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, how we and our data actually turn out to be the product. So when you're on Google, when you're on your Android phone, you are the product. That's not a plug for Apple. That's just the reality. When you're on Facebook, we are the product. They're selling our information, and this is having real world consequences. As I say, just the mental health of young girls, and you look at the suicide rates and the pressure and the alienation of our young girls, it's actually terrifying if you look into it, which I have. And Jonathan Haidt is a name there that, if you're interested at all, is worth looking at. Has a number of books, and he's a social researcher at the New York University. Another area is AI warfare, and we're seeing some of this in spades in Ukraine. But I thought this was telling, that in 2018, there were a couple of books and things about lethal autonomous weapons, and Stuart Russell, who's from Berkeley, has been long labouring about the issues of lethal autonomous weapons. What's lethal autonomous weapons? Lethal autonomous weapon is a drone, an underwater drone, a tank, a bomb that will actually that will do targeting, and it will make the kill decision itself. And there is I thought there was a moratorium, but I found out that actually there's a UN policy to try and prevent the proliferation of lethal autonomous weapons, and the normal holdouts are holding out, i.e. Russia and the USA, the people that hold out against landmine treaties as well. And what fascinated me when I went to do an update on lethal autonomous weapons is that the first site that I came across was from the International Committee of the Red Cross. So in 5 years, this has gone from being a university author or two to being the Red Cross. And it's something they're now dealing with on the battlefield. You've seen examples of cyber warfare already, and this is growing. And it's not just attacking, who knows whether the Optus attack was a Russian attack or a retribution, but retribution was expected in the US for cyber warfare after the support in the Ukraine. And we had 2 or 3 that were made public. We had other ones that aren't public yet. But a good example would be Stuxnet, where they introduced a virus to the centrifuges in Iran. And that was, that just to give you a flavor of AI powered warfare and lethal autonomous weapons. As I say, it's good and bad. I'm working on a project in conjunction with the Adelaide University and University of California, San Jose. And we're using AI to find and detect criminals and victims of sexual violence. So basically, we're doing voice matching and face matching and statistical network analysis and some pretty cool tools that are actually identifying real time victims and perpetrators, and the sources of CSAM, so child sexual abuse material. So that's just one example, but sadly, that crime is also being, and I've presented this in the cybersex landscape, so I won't go over it, I won't labor it. But of course, the AI is going to be used for people who want to commit that sort of crime. And we're not very far away from being able to have AI produced child sex videos. Can have a lot of trouble telling what is real and what's unreal. There's a fascinating video I watched. I think some of it is a little bit over the top, but some of it from my day job rings very, very true. And Tristan Harris was a Google employee who went out and tried to start to inform us about how we're being manipulated by social media. And we're being manipulated by AI to click and get engagement And that engagement is what enables the social media companies to sell our data, to sell their advertising, and to make their gazillions, where gazillion is just an estimate. So they have a Center for Humane Technology, and I thoroughly recommend that video, because I think they do. In fact, I would have been quite happy to just run their video tonight instead of talk to you myself. I think you watch that, you'll get far more from listening to me than from listening to me. But one of the things that they pointed out, and this is a clip from their video, in the second or third slide there, I said before that the area of natural language processing and transformers. So in 2017, I didn't realize that the fields of AI were already combining. So computer vision, that's recognizing people or objects or whatever from video, which is exactly what we're doing at the university. Speech recognition, again, that's what we're doing, but also robotics, speech synthesis, natural language processing, music, image generation. All these fields actually turned, with the use of something called transformers, they all turned into language. So now AI, or the generative large language models, ChatGPT and their like, which we'll get into in a minute, are all about language. So video or images, it's all about red, green, blue at a particular location. So that has an input and an output, and you can use that just as you can for computer code bits. It all gets encoded with transformers for input and output. And essentially, I know that doesn't make much sense, but essentially it means that you've sort of got a Tower of Babel effect, where you couldn't read papers from somebody else's area and apply it to your area, say speech to voice or voice to natural language processing. But after the advent of transformers, and I'm told that they're only about 200 lines of code, so it's the concept that is powerful, not the code being difficult. But since that time, all of the AI field has been moving forward because they're actually able to read each other's papers and able to contribute essentially to the same field. So large language models, I'm going to assume everybody's looked at or seen ChatGPT. Google's equivalent is Bard, and we might have a chance to look at it a bit later. It's pretty much the same thing. The large language model uses neural networks. So what the researchers did was they start looking at our brains and how the synapses and the neurons work, and that's why it's called a neural network. And so what they started to do was to wire up neural networks to sort of, it's a very, very gross analogy, but to sort of try and mimic the way that they understand the brain might communicate. And there's an input layer where you feed it data, text, mainly text at this stage, but it will be video and sound before too long. Then there's all these network layers or hidden layers and an output layer that now outputs to natural language, to text. And these models, the training of these models is huge. It comes from basically the data and code from the internet. They're hoovering up these large companies like Google, like OpenAI, with the backing of Microsoft, are hoovering up pretty much everything that's available on the internet, that's available in libraries, it's on blogs, it's in all the code from GitHub, from all the available code repositories. And then what they do is they train it and they moderate it with rules from human overseers. Now, I've heard one gentleman, Stuart Russell, who's who whose book I had linked in the a couple of slides back, talking about lethal autonomous weapons. He's a very senior voice in the AI research field. He's been working on at Berkeley on AI research for over 40 years. And the moderation that we're talking about here is large, he said, think of it like this. You're training a dog, and when it does something good, you praise it. And when it does something bad, you smack it. And he said, that's what the moderators are largely doing with these models. And when I say model, just think of a big circuit that has an enormous amount of input, and then it actually adjusts its layers, and it actually can generate output. If we have time, maybe in the question and answer time, I'll give the analogy for these models that I've heard from one of the researchers that I thought made most sense at a lay level. But the number of parameters is huge. So, for instance, the word dog would be added to the word embedding matrix, and it might have a vector, and it's encoded in a vector, and that word dog might be encoded like this. Now, how do I know that? Well, I asked Bard, and it told me how it worked, which is actually pretty useful, because Bard also told me that it has 137 billion such parameters. That's what it's trained on. And so in one sense, and in actuality, all this is doing is text prediction. All that circuit is doing is like your mobile phone. Hi, honey, could you pick up some blah on the way home, right? Milk, right? No use crying over spilt milk. It's doing word prediction. We're familiar with this, right? So it's just that it's gotten so damn good at it. There are other things happening as well. So in a real way, it is simply doing text prediction. Bear that in mind. So the large language models, they're ChatGPT and Bard, and there's another one that actually released today, is called Anthropic. And there's also Reliable AI. Reliable AI? I'm sorry, it's just gone. Anyway, these are, what it stands for is generative pre-trained large language models. We just talked about the training. You ask it questions and it generates answers. It's not doing anything when you're not asking it a question, but they are conversational. And that's weird, because as we were talking about before the presentation, this is the first entity that I think mankind has talked to, other than mankind, or 150 words or something with a trained gorilla or chimp or whatever they are, right? It's the first time we as humans have actually ever had conversations with something that isn't us. And ChatGPT has got an enormous, at 10 billion, I know for sure, but I think it's a lot more than that by Microsoft. And Bard is Google. And what's really important about this is generated can be new. It's not search. I want to demonstrate this with something. If you were to go to this URL, this dash person does not exist, right? It generates faces. That person there does not exist. That person is generated. You can't do a Google search on that person and find them in a database somewhere, because it's generated, right? You can't find a bio for her. She doesn't exist. I hope that really draws a distinction between ChatGPT and Bard and the new tools versus a search engine. And ChatGPT and the large language models, okay, they can converse with you, they can answer questions. What else can they do? They can answer questions, they can generate text, they can summarize text. In fact, they're brilliant at summarizing text. Can you give me a summary of the book of Job? You'll be surprised how good it is. Can you give me a summary of C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity? You'd be surprised how good that is. It can do sentiment analysis, like it can figure out what sort of mood or sentiments are being expressed in a text. It can certainly, and this is the problem for the teachers, it can certainly be your creative writing assistant, and it does a very good job of writing computer code and translating languages. It's apparent that it feels like it understands natural language, and those languages can be pretty much any language on earth, or in fact, new ones that you can ask it to create. It can engage in philosophical and theological conversations, and it feels a bit weird. And it can enhance a lot of existing functions, which is why Microsoft is rushing to put it into as many of its products as it can, whether it's Word, whether it's Bing search or whatever. They see it as a way of denting Google's market dominance. As an example, now there's a product called GitHub Copilot, which I haven't paid for, but I use the free version a lot. And I sat there for the first couple of weeks of using it, not just looking at it where it was today, but actually looking at where it was headed and going, do I give up programming? Do I encourage other people to take up programming? I don't know. I'm actually very open-minded about this because I'm not really sure, but already the advances in this area of coding are staggering. Still on capabilities, here's one of the examples from that video that I suggested you watch. They put people in an FRMI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, MRI machines, but functional, so that they can actually see which bits of the brain light up when the person is having some sort of input. And just reading, I guess, lots and lots of MRIs and training the AI on the MRIs, they were actually able to draw pictures of what the person was looking at. Now, I hope that makes sense, because essentially the AI is reading with the help of an FRMI, it's actually reading the person's mind as to what they're seeing. And that's pretty out there in my view. Worse now, and this is a prediction I made back in 2018, that deep fakes and audio and video for identification and for evidence for our legal system would be problematic. And we're getting close. As part of my work with the university, one of the researchers I work with says, no, we can still tell when something's a fake audio or a fake video. We can still tell forensically, but it's an arms race. There's no guarantee that that's going to be true tomorrow. And so now there's already been a number of instances, particularly in the US, where 3 seconds of audio, and these tools are widely available. I signed up for one. 3 seconds of audio, and then you can clone somebody's voice. So I could get Kevin's voice and clone it, and then what I do is I can make Kevin say anything I like. And that's true for video too. So you can think about the implications of, say, they roll out these tools to everybody on TikTok, and you have for the next elections, and you have one side of politics claiming one thing from the mouth of the opposition. So you might have, to take US politics, because that's a little bit more distant than us, you could have Joe Biden saying words that Trump has said, or you can make up Joe Biden to say whatever he wants. And similarly for whoever the Republican candidate is. So with the tools available today, you could really do some harm on TikTok and the social media platforms from some of these tools that are existing. There's also other areas, not ChatGPT. I don't know if you know about AlphaFold. One of the biggest issues in biology was to try and determine from the protein structure, how to tell from the chemical makeup of a protein how it will fold. Because how it will fold will tell you what it does. And it's a huge, so this was solved by DeepMind. And this is a huge, huge breakthrough. And it really is profound for medicine, for agriculture, but pretty much for biology as a whole. And this happened within the last 12 months. And it's being rolled out, and they're making it available. DeepMind is making it available in the public domain. And psychology. Interestingly enough, I've got a friend who's a psychologist. She said, "Hey, Tom, have a look at this." And essentially, she sent me this article from a psychologist who couldn't get to sleep, and he was really suffering from anxiety. So he went to an AI, what do you call it? An AI bot, right? And we talked back in 2018 about Wobot, about people doing this in public. It's in public domain. You can sign up for Wobot, and it can be your mental health friend, right? But here's a mental health professional who's now Dr. David Trevelyan. In their professional journal, he's actually writing up an article about his interaction with an AI chatbot, how it helped him with his anxiety attack, and how this could actually be used in the future in his field. And so I got it. Then I asked ChatGPT, "Can you summarize that?" And I did similarly on Bard. And you know, you can read it there. He's saying, "Wow, this is wonderful, and we got to use this, and we got to be a little bit careful, but wow, I'm hoping this is going to transform mental health." You know, I don't offer any takeaways there. I'm just reporting on what's happening, right? But the scope of use of these chatbots is really broad. And there are two stories in this YouTube video that I saw a number of months ago from Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft. He talked about the chief designer of the Tesla autopilot, who now has 80% of his code is now done by that Copilot tool, by ChatGPT. Okay. And then he talked about, he said, I was visiting India, and he is Indian, native Indian. And he's talked to somebody in rural India using their local Indian language, not Hindi or English, talking to a chatbot on WhatsApp. And he wanted access to some Indian government program. And he's out in the sticks somewhere. And it turns out that India had made the government docs were made available via language translation. So now, because there's an AI engine sitting the other side of WhatsApp, he was able to get his government application done from WhatsApp in his local language. So it's gone the gamut. It's gone from rural India in some language that nobody's going to learn, and it's straddling the heights of technology in the Bay Area for the Tesla autopilot programmer. So that's where we are. And this is today. This is today, right? So you've got to get onto these tools and play with them a little bit, and then you'll get a feel. That's actually much better than my talking. But now let's look at the near term and the future and the future risks and fears. And I'm going to have to just skip a little bit. I didn't get to time this talk. I'm sorry. I had some interruptions to my preparation. There's also, and I'm going to talk mainly about the bad. Why? Because the tech companies are going to be selling you enough on all the good. You need to know what we need to be thinking about, not why you should buy it or why you should spend your money or why you should use it. These AI engines today give wrong answers and they'll hallucinate. Google's AI engine actually has a Google search button so you can verify the answers. Schools and education, this is not a done discussion. How we use them there, interesting. Employment and how they're used there. Programmers, I have no idea what I would tell somebody learning programming today. I don't know. They are apparently growing a theory of mind, which is an awareness of what other people think, right? That's a philosophical and psychological concept, theory of mind. There are existential risks that we'll talk about. They are capable today of exploiting internet security vulnerabilities. We'll talk about sentience and consciousness, maybe a little bit, rights and values. Certainly, they can exacerbate child sexual abuse, and the societal and legal challenges with deep fakes are going to be profound. There are significant implications on religions. I'm a Christian, by the way. I'm not too worried about that. Political and ideological bias is going to probably get a lot worse. There's huge implications for commercial and business. Let's just look at some of this. Existential risks, though, you know, and this is sort of listening to a number of folks who make the argument that we're in charge of the planet because of our intelligence. Well, let's go with that for the moment, right? If you look at the comparison of that is a nematode worm on the left-hand side, or bonobos with their 100, 150 words of language to somebody like an Albert Einstein. And then you look at where the intelligence or the capability of something like ChatGPT 3 and 4 and maybe Bard are. By the way, ChatGPT 3.5 is the current version. ChatGPT 4 has not been released to my knowledge yet. And there's a lot of activity in the government in the US to that maybe there'll be holdups on it. And maybe somewhere along the line, we'll get to a super intelligence, artificial general intelligence. There's a whole lot of reasons to think that that may be possible. I don't know if that will be possible. There's a lot of conflict within the AI researchers as to whether that's going to be possible. And if it is, then how long? But it's certainly true that you could have 1,000 AIs learning, and when one AI learns something, it shares it with another 1,000 or million or 2 million straight away. So you could have multiple advances in learning and capacities. So it certainly seems that it could improve much faster than humans. It seems feasible. And it also seems feasible to me that AI could be a danger, an existential danger to humanity, along the lines of the nuclear weapons. And this gentleman here, Jeffrey Hiddleston, have I got the name right? He's from the University of Toronto. He's called the godfather of AI. He recently left Google. You may have seen the headlines, to try and sound some of the warning bells about the existential threats to us from AI. There are other people who are actually also very pro AI, thinking it's going to just solve all our problems. Very hard to figure out the reality. I'm just bringing some of the opinions to you. It also could be that AI doesn't do anything to harm us. It just is not aligned with us. And that's actually what this slide was getting at. If we asked the AI, if we gave it a goal of produce paper clips, and then we didn't align those goals, and maybe we could never stop it creating paper clips. And if we wanted to turn it off, it would see it as a threat to its goal of producing paper clips. That's one of the stories that gets told about how we might have something called misalignment. One of the things that's making people nervous and making the AI researchers nervous is the surprising emergence of new capabilities that are not trained for. They're translating from new languages that they weren't trained for. They're translating to new languages. They're solving problems in fields that they weren't trained on. I mentioned the theory of mind. They are never trained with a theory of mind. And yet as they measure it, and I don't know how it's measured, so don't, I can't back this up, but I'm just giving it as an example of where the researchers themselves are saying that this is getting scary. And I did tell you back in 2018, we asked the tech companies, how did these things emerge? And they replied nervously, we've no idea. And that's called the black box problem. And we did look at that back in 2018. I mentioned that because it's gotten a lot worse. The models have gotten more complex and we have less and less understanding of them. Could consciousness emerge on a naturalist, materialist worldview? Possibly, yes. Maybe we can talk about David Chalmers, the Australian philosopher's story about that. But on a Judeo-Christian worldview, if a Judeo-Christian worldview reflects reality, then no, because we're not just our brains. The challenging issue is it might get hard to tell. And already there was a Google employee sacked because he claimed that Lambda, which is, I don't think publicly available, but an engine like ChatGPT, was sentient. And he wrote blog posts, etc., substantiating that, and Google didn't like it. The interesting thing there is that he believed it enough to put his employment at Google at an end, and he's only a young guy. You can search for that, you'll find the story. There's a great article on Reasons to Believe that really refers to this incident, about why it's not sentient. And I've got about 9 minutes left to talk to you. So I'm going to skip some of these things, and I apologize that I don't have this better timed. Maybe we can address some of these during the question and answer. But there's also good reasons for thinking that actually an AI can never become conscious. It can never actually have understanding. Now, another of the risks is the arms race. And there's two. There's the commercial arms race between the likes of Microsoft and Google. Microsoft is backing OpenAI and putting OpenAI, ChatGPT into all their products. And there's a huge amount of venture capital going into AI products. There's not much money, relatively speaking, being spent on safety, i.e. spanking the dog when it does something like give you advice on how to commit suicide, for instance. That's a real example from Germany. And as I said, the tools are getting so much more capable than the researchers are expecting or predicted. And yet the arms race, the commercial arms race, means that the companies are releasing them as quickly as they can for competitive advantage. There's also the the arms race between Russia and China and the US. I mentioned the ban on lethal autonomous weapons, and who knows a fraction of what is happening here. But I'm guessing it's not pleasant. And when you think about a lethal autonomous weapon making a targeting and a kill decision, right? So there you've got a drone that's programmed to go and kill one person. Well, I'm sure all the AI folks, I'm sure Brian's aware of this, and other, sorry, the IT folks, Brian, any bit of code, you can put a for loop around it. You know, you can make one drone kill one people, or you can have 1 million drones kill 1 million people, or you can have one drone attempt to kill 1 million people. That's one of the problems with lethal autonomous weapons. Automating death just seems to be not a great idea. In fact, it's interestingly, one of the pieces of technology that probably led to more deaths in World War I was the humble train, because it got more people into the meat grinder that was the front than anything else. You couldn't do that with horse and cart. There are also risks. In fact, I've seen email on the Reasonable Faith email. I've had chats with people about risks to Christian faith or to the church. Again, I'm not too worried here, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be paying attention. The AI chatbots could produce believable falsehoods. In fact, there's already an AI church somewhere in California. I need not say much more. Write high quality and engaging and useful sermons. Actually, it's funny. Already been trying that out. And yeah, I'm not sure that's a bad news category. But inventing new religions, that's, as I say, already happening. And this, I think, underneath, there's still this age-old fear that somehow science and tech will somehow turn over a rock or write some algorithm that will somehow disprove the existence of God or disprove the resurrection of Christ. I don't think that's going to happen, because I actually think I think God exists, and I think Christ was resurrected. So I have a great calm over that one. And it gives me great freedom to ask a lot of questions and figure out where this stuff is headed. But here's a really good example. Here's a really good set of things that you can try. Ask Bard or ChatGPT to summarize the Old Testament. Ask it how it determined its conclusions, and ask Bard to produce, or ChatGPT to produce, a 15-minute sermon on the book of Job. All good things to do, and actually all really interesting. In one way, I heard one researcher say, in fact, it was the guy who invented Mosaic and Netscape, Mark Andreessen, who's now in AI venture capital. And he said, you've got to understand, with these chatbots, they're us talking to us. And that's an interesting thing to think about. Do they have ideological bias? This is another one of the fears and risks. You better believe it. I thought I'd better pick something topical. So I asked ChatGPT, why is homosexuality wrong? And it came back and it gave me a fairly predictable answer. And I asked it why it was right, and it gave me a lot more substantiation. I asked it, I also asked it, did it have relativistic models because of where it was trained? And it basically said, yeah, probably. And it's been trained on the west coast of the US, where relativism and very, I don't want to use the word progressive. I'm trying not to use the word woke, but you know what I mean, where it's not surprising that it would be a very humanist type approach from the moderation of these AI engines. So they're talking to us, relating to us in first person, and that feels weird, and that's unsettling. So this, I'm just trying to summarize the risks, why these things are making us feel uncomfortable, why it's making the researchers feel uncomfortable. It's all too new and changing too rapidly, and nobody seems to be in control except the tech companies, and that works out well now, right? The experts are clearly worried, so that should worry us. And we simply don't know what we don't know. I've got a few minutes, and I'm going to steal a couple of minutes if I can, go a couple of minutes over time. In 2018, I had the second half of this presentation was addressing the utopian visions of AI, but they've all gone. You know, Hollywood doesn't make utopian technology films anymore. And I guess in those 5 years, we've had a global pandemic that killed millions. We have a war in Ukraine. We've had the re-emergence of inflation. And likely, to quote a pastor I listened to and a cultural analyst in out of Melbourne, from Red Church in Melbourne, Mark Sayers, we're likely in a grey zone. We're in between eras. You could say that before the iPhone and smartphones was an era, after the iPhones was an era. What are some of the practical considerations? We haven't even figured out whether we should use or limit them in education. And if we do, how do you police that? And that's, I mean, what I've seen out of the ed departments and stuff so far is just a scrambling to respond or to react. It's not really a good and thought out response. Why? Because they're looking at where we are today. They're not looking at where we're headed. And that's not useful, because they'll be continually scrambling. But our ed department is not at all unusual. Pretty much all of our leaders, whether it's our teachers, whether it's our judges, that's a particularly difficult one, whether it's our or whether it's our pastors or us as in general, we're struggling because the pace of change and the level of unknowns. It turns out we can limit the rollout of these. There's a lot of existing legislation that can be used. The control problem is one that raises really profound questions about human friendliness. I said one of the things we want, one of the risks to us is if these AIs aren't aligned with human values. Interestingly enough, probably a decade ago now, long before I gave the presentation in 2018, the presentations in 2018, I was listening to a very secular, very humanist podcast, the Guardian Science podcast, which I listen to regularly. And they had Peter Singer, Sam Harris, and a few others. They were arguing that if AI became sentient or conscious, that it would be deserving of human rights and human values. Of human rights and of dignity. These are the same people who argue that a 6-month-old fetus should be abortable, and I'll go on about that in a minute. So the goal alignment, and I'm sorry, to finish that thought, it really started me thinking about the profound questions that AI and mankind's or humanity's attempts to create another intelligence. What does it tell us about ourselves? And so from this control, and then they talked about the control problem. How do we align it with our values? And, once the genie is out of the bottle, it's too late, right? We need to be thinking about that now. In fact, we need to be thinking about it years ago. And in the secular West, and I think Peter Singer is such a great example, in the secular West, we either overtly or inadvertently equate human worth with intelligence. Now, Peter Singer, who's an Australian philosopher who lectures at Princeton, he argues things like this: that human babies, you should be able to kill them a month, 28 days after they're born, because, maybe their parents didn't get a chance to abort them if they had something wrong with them. And he thinks that, to give preference for, a baby less than a month old is not really sentient. And he was arguing that an AI, if it became sentient, should actually have more rights. Pretty much more rights than he wants to give a 28-day-old baby. I put his quotes there just so that you know that I'm not catastrophizing, but I'm actually quoting him in context. So whose values? Whose values do we want to align with the AIs? And at the moment, it's the West Coast of the US. That's something that I think should concern us. It should concern everybody. Let me just quickly raise some of the other questions and then I'll stop talking. I think it raises hugely the question of why humans are valuable and why do social justice. Yuval Noah Harari, very, very secular, anti-theist. Human rights are a story we tell ourselves. I think he's right. I think to some degree he's right. And Tom Holland, the historian and author of Dominion, he says, well, yeah, but Christianity's given us all of our values. And he said in a recent podcast that I listened to, the existence of angels is no less believable than the existence of human rights. This is really interesting things to revisit as we talk about AI getting to human level or exceeding human level intellect. And if we start to give them moral and if we start giving them value, I don't have time. I'm going to have just a couple more minutes, guys. Bear with me. Are these things going to ever have agency? I think it's really, really interesting to think about. You know, to quote William Lane Craig, if a lion kills an antelope, it kills it, doesn't murder it. If a male grizzly mates with an unwilling female, it doesn't commit rape, right? I mean, we don't have moral agency associated with animals. Well, can an AI ever make a moral choice? On what basis? Where would that agency come from? And does it come purely from intelligence? Guys like Nick Bostrom at Oxford argue that, yes, as we get smarter, we'll get more moral. I think he's got a very, very large blind spot in his philosophy. So if an AI kills everybody, if it commits murder, rape, if a super intelligence kills, does it commit murder, genocide? Is it evil? And if secular ethics originates in humanities, there's no reason we should complain. It's more intelligent than us. We should just move over. And the modern secular person can't explain or say this by saying to the AI, which they do increasingly in the Western culture, oh, you wouldn't understand. You would understand if you're as enlightened as we are. But that no longer works if the AI is a lot more intelligent than us. I'm going to have to skip these but I'll post this. Could we have a relationship with you, AI? I think there's a whole lot of things that AI points out about human uniqueness, and I think that has some real implications on design. So, in summary, if we succeed in making a super intelligence, right, or an artificial general intelligence, if we succeed and we're still broken, there's still evil in the world, well, that means that evil and stuff doesn't come from, and it's not solved by intelligence. And if human design of intelligence has created an intelligence, does that mean that we're also designed? I mean, what does it say about the evolutionary origins, the unguided evolutionary origins of our intelligence? What does it say about morality? If there's still evil and brokenness in the world, once we have an AGI, then surely it leads to the conclusion that morality comes from outside of humanity. And if we can't create an artificial general intelligence, maybe we have to conclude that humans are unique, human intelligence is unique, and we need to ask questions of why we are and how is that cosmic accident actually possible. I just really encourage our secular friends to revisit the origins of human values, intellect and worth. Mind and Cosmos by Thomas Nagel is a brilliant, is a brilliant book about why the neo-Darwinist concept of nature. But by the way, this guy's let me finish one sentence. I'm trying to rush. Why the neo-Darwinist conception of nature is almost certainly false. It's a book about consciousness and how that couldn't possibly have come about just by unguided evolution. And to revisit the secular narrative and parables, there's some amazing stories of people sharing or losing huge amount of their brains and yet doing well. How is that possible if we're just a neural network and there's nothing else to us? I'm going to script these responses, although actually maybe I won't. Don't be scared by this stuff. Be strong and be courageous. Don't be afraid. Don't be discouraged. Right. This is our, I really think we have tools as Christians. We have resources for actually dealing with change, and it's not putting our heads in the sand. Be informed because nature and tech are already forming your kids and your grandkids. If I choose nothing else tonight, I hope everybody goes and gets on ChatGPT and they look at, or they go to Deep Nude and they see what the kids are looking at, right? Because we can't tell our kids or our grandkids how to make sense of culture with the gospel if we don't understand culture. And then I could have almost skipped this slide because it turned out that the Southern Baptist conventions are actually ahead of me. They just had a big meeting on this, and they basically just made a whole heap of resolutions, which you can find in that URL. Essentially, don't put your head in the sand and proactively engage. Don't be afraid, and figure out how we can actually help people understand and maybe even manage these new technologies. And by the way, if we ever do create a super intelligence and we ask it about the meaning of life, the universe, and everything, I don't think it'll give the answer 42. I actually expect it to give the answer Jesus Christ. And that's me done. Sorry, I'm over time, guys. Kevin.
I had to unmute myself. Thank you very much for that. There are some questions on the chat, some of them from me, but I'd rather Bronwyn speak to her points that she's made.
Oh, okay, yeah. I said one of my broad concerns would be social isolation, wherein people can only converse with AI generally. While there could be some advantages to conversing with AI incidentally, doing this all the time could actually be a possibility, which results in more community disconnect rather than connection. And I suppose I see that in the community itself, we have a bit of disconnect already, where children aren't very good at communicating to others, or not as good as what our grandparents would have been. They don't naturally talk to strangers or chat as a community type thing, walking down the street or saying hello, conversing that way. And I just see this type of thing making us more inward and less outward. Yeah.
And there's a hell of a lot of research that already backs that up. And that's why I included the clip from my psychologist friend, or the slide from my psychologist friend, and from the bit in one of their professional journals. I think this is one of the things where and I don't know if we've got any non-Christians. No, I don't think so from looking, but as Christians, I think we actually have opportunities and maybe responsibilities to take those problems seriously. Loneliness is certainly an epidemic in the US and growing, and throughout Europe, and that's growing. Jonathan Haidt, who I referred to earlier, if you look at some of his work on what's happening, particularly to our young girls, with isolation, it's none of it is healthy. And I think if you're concerned that AI is going to put that on steroids, I think your concern is valid. And I think all we can do is to highlight the benefits and make our communities the benefits of community, and to make them welcoming and make people realize they need it. They're not realizing how much we're actually not realizing We actually need community,
Mm.
or at least perhaps very, very slowly.
But like things like people playing with their mobile phones or kids playing games.
Yeah.
A lot of that is social isolation is a cause from those causes. It's not just a problem with AI.
Well,
No.
but actually, there's an AI component, because interacting with their phones, what are they on? They're on Instagram, they're on Snapchat, and those are specifically targeted to actually engage. So what's happening is we're pitting our little brains against a huge AI, doing on camera, right? And we're not winning that battle. Particularly young adolescent minds are not going to win that battle. This is the basis of Tristan Harris's work in The Social Dilemma, and honestly, I'm familiar enough with it and with the other social research to go, you should watch the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, because what's happened, because of how the AI companies, the social media companies decided to monetize their platform, which is advertising. Advertising needs engagement. Because they decided to maximize engagement, that one thing, the goaling of the AI, which is to engage. And by the way, it turns out the best way to actually engage people is to actually radicalize them, to take extremes. And that's proven a very, very effective model. You know this because you can just go to NASDAQ or to the New York Stock Exchange and look at the valuations of these companies. They're trillions. It's already a problem. These chat bots are going to put it on steroids. Sorry.
And I think it might
No,
get it's very easy. Chatbots are getting better at chatting like normal friends with users, and so a lot of people will kind of lean on that as the friend that's always there for them and that won't say anything too nasty. There's much more extreme cases like the guy with a robot girlfriend. Those are always going to be a small number, but it's easy to imagine lots of kids just finding a chat bot that'll be the one they chat with all the time instead of normal friends.
Yeah.
Chatbot's nicer than their normal friends.
That's his
because
point.
you can get on chat and you can throw all sorts of insults at it, and it's gentle, patient, and kind.
Yeah.
But I've tried experiments on it. So it actually epitomizes some of the characteristics of loves that you don't actually find in normal human beings.
That's right. Yeah.
Well,
I did have another question, unless anyone wants to add or a point. I said I've got a teaching background, so I said from an education point of view, perhaps critical thinking becomes more important than how to write essays.
And how does that relate to AI?
Well, what's true and what's false. I just see that writing essays, which is what actually I teach kids to do, year 3, 4s, is that going to be relevant in 20 years, 15 years time? Because
when AI is doing our thinking for us, we don't have to think critically ourselves. Let AI do the thinking and just believe what it tells us.
Yeah, I know. So we have to be able to learn how to think critically about something that's put to us, advantages, disadvantages, and so on, ethics and stuff like that. I sort of wonder whether we're, and I'm sure people are thinking this way, what's relevant? Industrial revolution came, we put kids in schools, we all learn the same way. And the thing with education is we've stayed in the same type of format, and technology's really exploding, so that we have to change something, and perhaps what we learn or is becoming more important, you know. So anyway, it's just an issue that educators are going to have to look at, really. Is it going to be really important and learn how to write an essay when you can ask a robot to write one for you? You know, like, is that a relevant skill anymore? that's
I'm not an educator. So I, back in 2018, when I tried to ring the bell, I do wonder whether there would have been an advantage or no advantage if people had been thinking about that back then. And similarly, I have a friend who's a nurse educator, and I posted something on Facebook about AI, and she complained how annoying it was. Of course, I can tell. She was marking exam papers or something, and she complained that it's really annoying, these new chatbots, because of course I can tell which ones have been generated with ChatGPT and which ones haven't. But it's just time consuming going through it. And I thought, I'm still not being heard, because the ChatGPT that you've got today is not the ChatGPT that you're going to have in 6 months. ChatGPT 4 is already there, and it's already a vast leap over ChatGPT 3. So anything we've interacted with today, Kevin, is nowhere near the sophistication as what's already in the labs within Google, within Microsoft, and so I just feel like we've got to stop reacting, and we need to start thinking a little bit about where those are headed. So, Brahman, your question is exactly right. I don't know the answer. I don't even know how to get to the answer.
Yeah.
I think critical thinking is something that as a society, as a culture, we have abandoned well and truly quite some time ago. That is really important. We need to emphasize that a bit more, to teach in schools our young people to think, not just to listen to what they're told, but to actually think for themselves, work through the arguments, and be able to come to conclusions personally.
And problem solving becomes a big issue too, and how to solve social issues, because they're not learning them like we did when we were younger. They're reacting more than they are. They're not taught manners, or they're just not taught the stuff that we were taught when we were younger, and they didn't have the same constraints over them that we had. So, it's very problematic. The kids aren't generally learning the social skills we would like them to learn. And this is just going to make it even worse, I think, because they get more socially isolated. There's lots of positives about it too, but I don't know, it throws everything up in the air, and you've got to try and rethink what we need to learn. Yeah.
I think it requires critical thinking skills to ask the right questions.
Yeah.
And actually delve in. But anyway, Charles has made some comments. Would you like to actually speak on those, Charles?
He needs to unmute.
You need to unmute.
Okay, so the first one is just following on from this previous discussion. To what extent can you teach people to think critically if they don't have the knowledge on which to make those choices? And how are they going to get that knowledge if all of it is just a Google or a chatbot away? That's an interesting question, I would think. Just to alert you, I occasionally listen to Jordan Peterson podcasts, and I think number 357 was with Brian Romola, and they were arguing about how what you need is to actually have your own private AI system, so that your particular material is not automatically available to everyone around the world. And maybe newspapers might do the same. And the discussion was about Jordan Peterson having all of the stuff he's ever written on a hard drive at home, and he wouldn't mind having that in a ChatGPT thing, but he'd want it to be private. And the interesting thing was whether the ChatGPT could actually draw conclusions that he wasn't aware of from all his material. So that was just an interesting reference on the side. But the thing that gets to me is, if I don't know how ChatGPT is working, not that I need to know how the results come out, but if I don't know what the basic mechanism is, then it's tempting to call some results as intelligent when maybe they aren't. Maybe they're just, because ChatGPT has this vast database that basically it's picking out things that, because I don't have that breadth of knowledge, that I have not really thought about. And so that raises the question, can ChatGPT make a paradigm shift? In other words, like Einstein, not just conclude from what's there, but actually come up with a radically new idea, a new perspective on things.
Yes.
So that's my question.
Yes, but based on a synthesis, there's not a database. The reason Charles, you raise a number of really good issues here, and I thank you for that, because there's a couple I didn't have time to cover in my spiel. I listened to that Jordan Peterson interview, by the way, and it was fascinating because he was getting the other gentleman was getting the AI to role play and to imagine. So that's a part of an answer, but the other part of the answer to your question about can it make a paradigm shift or come up with something new, that's the G part. That's why I stress the generative. There's no database. There's no database here. It's not doing a Google search. It's been trained as a neural network. And so like this person does not exist, it can generate new material, but in the style of however it's been trained. So yes, it is coming up with new things. It's actually come up with a new language. And that's there are capabilities emerging, and yeah, our human tendency to anthropomorphize, I think, is going to lead more and more people to think that this thing has intelligence. Maybe it does have some rights. I think that's going to have to be a battle, but I'm actually looking forward to that battle, because I think it's going to make a lot of secular people go, well, what is human? Where are our values from? How do they come about? I think that's a conversation that of great apologetic worth going forward from this point on. And let me just address the other thing. It said, could you have it personally? I have in one of my slides in the deck, and I'm going to post these to SlideShare, so you'll be able to get the slides there. But I wasn't 100% sure to start with how that would work. But yes, even one of my friends from Oracle was showing me the other day something called Cohere, C-O-H-E-R-E, like, to make sense, to cohere. And that is an AI trained, but it's a private AI for private business. Think private law enforcement in Australia. Think, private medical records in Australia. So already there are AIs coming about, but then that was confusing, because I thought, well, but hang on, if you need the scope of the internet to actually run these things, but actually it turns out you don't. You need that huge data to train them. And then I've seen people saying, no, they're going to be on your mobile phones or on your laptop, and you will have your own. So what Jordan Peterson is talking about there seems to be actually mainstream. It seems to be what a lot of the investment is going into. So instead of using ChatGPT, you'll use Kevin GPT, or you'll use Telstra GPT, or whatever it will be, right? And that makes your problem even harder, Bronwyn, because if we have these things if the kids have these things on their phone, and they can answer any question just like they can ChatGPT. Now, bear in mind, ChatGPT is large today because it's servicing over 100 million people, all answering it questions, all asking it questions. 100 million. It went to 100 million. Actually, the quickest app to ever get to 100 million users, subscribers.
Why was Jordan Peterson concerned to protect, have his information private?
Yes, because, so for instance, I was contributing to a paper for the uni the other day on child safety, and I was having trouble wording my section, right? And I said, hey, can I use, because I thought the answer would be no, can I use ChatGPT to word it for me? No. Well, because the moment you use ChatGPT or Bard, you give ownership of what you've got to them. It's like when you put your photos into Google Photos, you actually share ownership of your photos. You share ownership of your musical work. You share ownership of your publication. You still retain ownership, but you actually share ownership now. So for that reason, you know, we might not want everybody in the US to be trained on things from Australian culture. I don't know, whatever. That's no different than data sovereignty that we have today in clouds. So our medical records by Australian legislation must be stored in Australia, not stored in the US.
Just a follow-up comment. I saw a talk by one of the engineers of ChatGPT 4, and he made the comment that ChatGPT 3 was really just an experiment to see how far word prediction would go. And in fact, it didn't do terribly much till they used questions to get it to respond. And then it just shot, then it really just blew it, you know, everything happened then. So I don't know whether that's, I mean, that's what I got out of his talk, whether that's really the case or not.
That correlates pretty well with some of the stuff that Jeffrey Hiddleston said. And I sort of, it was interesting watching talks from Jeffrey Hiddleston from Google and from University of Toronto. I know where Alexa and stuff came from now too, that there was a smart grad student he had who actually first figured out how to put natural language programming on graphics processing units on GPUs, which apparently the world is completely out of stock of now. So there are going to be some engineering limits to some of this as well. So yes, that makes sense. But the quantum leap between ChatGPT 3 and 4 is vast, and Google didn't release Bard until after OpenAI got to where they got. But I'd look at Stability AI. It's the open version of AI, and they're doing things for industry. So for medical, for government, for and actually doing something that really intrigued me. They've got a project in Malawi when they're putting their AIs onto tablets for kids to use in Malawi as learning tools. And I plan to research that a whole lot more because that's something that I dabble in. So for basically developing nations, Uganda specifically. But anyway, yes, so they're already doing that. Stability AI is the other one, and they're tied up with OpenAI somehow. I don't know enough yet. It's all very fast moving. In fact, actually, thank you all for listening to me this evening, and Kevin, thanks for doing this. I've been spending the last few weeks researching, and I've been blown away, frankly, by the advances and the breadth of impact of this stuff.
I think I speak for all of us, and what you were saying tonight was fascinating and really worthwhile, and we could let you go longer.
Yeah, thank you.
A lot of it seems to be very negative. What are some of the positives?
Oh, well, you know, a good example would be University of Cambridge Uni. Years ago, they started applying AI to their existing records, and they were able to overnight reduce the number of infections from their in their medical hospital, in the hospital associated with the university, they were able to reduce it something like 2/3 post-op infections by using the existing data. Already some of the stuff that we're getting in natural sciences, James Webb, nothing from the Large Hadron Collider would work. You've got the whole AlphaFold and what diseases we might find cures to. There's a lot of potential good. It's just that I focused on the implications tonight that we need to look at, because the companies themselves, the good isn't going to need a lot of consideration, right? We're not going to have to go, well, the autism one from Rosalind Pickard at MIT was one that in 2018 I actually featured. And they used the Google Glass for kids suffering from autism. And so they would actually give them cues, kids on the autism spectrum disorder, they would actually give them cues from the people around them that they would otherwise miss being autistic, and they could actually fit in a lot better. And I'm just going, in fact, if you want something really heartwarming, just go and Google Rosalind Pickard and MIT emotional AI lab or whatever it is. And I got to tell you, I actually had to stop looking. I was looking at one of her videos. I think it was a commencement address or something to, it was a Veritas forum. And I was just going, oh, that is how we should all be using AI. That is what we should all be getting behind. But the reality is we live in a broken world. We don't live in this utopian world that the tech heads in California would want you to believe, where we're all basically good. We just, we just need to be treated like we're all good. That just doesn't seem to
I can see, I can see you a very good use for AI. I often get outrageous comments on YouTube, on our YouTube videos, and people make a ridiculous comment. So you just go into ChatGPT, ask, is this statement true? And it comes up and says a whole lot of rubbish. You put that back in the post and they run away.
There you go. Now all you need to do
it's very good for answering the ridiculous.
Yeah.
And
now sign up to the AI. You know what API is? Application programming interface. Brian, obviously, and Eric basically know what that is. So what you want to be able to do is to put ChatGPT or Bard into your code, into an application. So you could have an app. So just what you said there, Kevin, right? You could actually have an application that talks to ChatGPT that posts your ridiculous answer, Googles it, and actually takes and posts it back to YouTube.
Oh, and well, I do have to think about it. It's not that easy. It's not mechanical.
Could be. Because these things can generate text, one of the questions asked, will most of the text on the internet over the next few years be generated? Good question. Good question. And how will you know when you're talking to one person?
And that'll be the problem of at the moment it's learning from stuff that's written by humans and sort of putting it all together. But if other people are just churning out stuff that is generated from that, then it sort of chokes on its own waste.
Correct. And that's what they did with AlphaGo. And that, in fact, that's what they do with adversarial networks. They have the AIs train the AIs. That's already a well-established technique.
Well, that's working for good. But if it keeps learning from things that have been automatically generated, then that's, I suppose, you you got the chance to build on discoveries, but you've also got the chance to build errors on top of each other.
Exactly. So how do you tell where's reality?
Do these tools mainly use peer-reviewed sources, or do they agnostic about whether stuff is rubbish or not that they're using?
They are being careful about their sources because they're being sued by a whole heap of artists and other people for two reasons. The normal one, you sue somebody that's got lots of money, right? That's a very usual thing to do. But also because the artists and a lot of people, like here I am, okay, it's fine. I'm at the end of my career. But what if I was a starting up musician or a starting up author or somebody like, and now I'm seeing, or even in Hollywood, I watched one thing today that was reasonably credible from the Stability AI guys, and they were demonstrating generated movies, right? Hence my issue about generated child sexual abuse material. But also, once you can get the AI to write the plot and you can get it to generate the video, sorry, why did we need all those people in Hollywood?
Well, that's a different kettle of fish. You're talking about accessing artistic sites.
Oh, sorry, I got off the track. Truth. Thank you.
If I want to find out the truth about something, I'd much rather use peer-reviewed sources than what any idiot says on the internet. Does it make a distinction?
My point is, I don't know. And the reason I don't know is because the companies are very careful about where their training data comes from, because they're being sued by a number of people already, including the artists. And there's going to be more.
I wouldn't be bothered with the artists anyway. I wouldn't care less about their opinions.
In terms of information, if you've got the whole internet, then you've kind of got the good and the bad and the sheer weight of it. As long as there's a majority of people telling the truth and putting things together competently, the majority of the time you'll come to the right answer. And I suppose they've been trained for the right answers. The only trouble is the hallucinations is because it's trained to produce confident answers, and so when it doesn't know, it'll still give you an answer confidently, because that's what it's being given positive reinforcement for.
Yes, and in fact, let me show you something to that very point, Eric. If you go onto Bard, which is the Google one, right? And oops, sorry, stop that. I'll try that again. Share screen and Firefox. Share. If you go on to Bard, you'll find a Google it button so that you can actually verify with search the results of the text that it generated for you. So you can just basically Google. It gives you a way of Google. It just made it assumes you're going to need to verify what you were told, and Google's put that there. This doesn't seem to be a solvable problem, if I understand what I've been listening to. Not a purely solvable problem, but it's going to be one of those things where it's practically solvable, right? I mean, we haven't solved the issue of planes falling out of the sky, but we've practically solved it to the point where everybody can get with good confidence on a plane and fly somewhere. I think that's going to be the difference.
When I've used it, I've asked questions, then I've said, where did you get this information from? And it comes back and it cites me the references. A lot of the references seem to be reputable. So to me, it's not as bad as what you're saying.
I watched a 60 Minutes interview with the Google CEO. Sorry, his name just escapes me. And it came back with a whole lot of book references and stuff like that. And they hit that Google it button. None of the books existed. Again, it's going to be a stats thing, right? As the model gets better, that's going to happen less.
I think it's funny how if you ask it to give you a joke about Jesus, it'll give you one, right? But if you ask it to give you a joke about Muhammad, it'll say, sorry, I'm ethically trained not to answer. Like, what? And then you say, why did you give me one about Jesus? And it says, I'm sorry if I've offended you. But yeah, Christians are easy going.
I think we all know the reason for that, right?
It's because we're forgiving, but it's also because it's what it's what it's learnt on, and it's got most of its text from situations where certain things you'd be okay about saying and other things you wouldn't be okay about saying.
Yeah.
Remember how much work has gone into spanking these puppies, right? If you remember back, there was something called, Microsoft tried this years ago with a chatbot called Tay. Within an hour, it was spitting out anti-Semitic, just awful stuff. It lasted an hour in the public domain. So that's why these things are regularly spanked and spanked hard. Of course, in that video that I showed you, the Centre for Humane Technology, right? The Tristan Harris one. It's interesting because they asked for, give me. It wasn't how do I make a bomb at home, but it was something more nuanced, and it basically gave you the production for like things like VX, nerve agent, and a few other things like that. So they need a lot more spanking before they're actually safe for the public. And it was something about chemistry. It was and that's how the guy in Germany, apparently, he got round the training to actually find out how to commit suicide with however he committed suicide. He actually got the AI to assist him.
And that's the problem, because you need it to be not just telling the truth, but also withholding the truth where the information is unhelpful.
Who gets to say helpful, Eric? That's my point about how do you align the values? Peter Singer's values? Sam Harris's values? I hope not. That's part of the reason for doing this talk, so that people realise that that's the default position as it stands right at the moment.
Just on that, Tom, just recently we had the issue of legislation coming in where the government can chase you for putting misinformation on the web. And comments have come from the government that they're looking at legislation to monitor and control it all. But from what you're describing, governments now don't have a lot of power really to control. Like with the technology, how do you chase up on people abusing the system? You can't put them in jail if they're in another country. You can't fine them. You know, like the whole accountability thing is very difficult.
Well, it's interesting. We were in Ethiopia and Uganda earlier in the year, and there was no Facebook, there was no social media in Uganda, in Ethiopia while we were there. So they can actually be blocked by the telcos at the national level. That's one thing. But to your point, yeah, because we're actually entwining these things more and more in our daily lives, people are increasingly doing business and commerce via WhatsApp. If you turn WhatsApp off, you turn off business and commerce. It's like their shop fronts are on a social media page. So you've now taken their entries, for those of us old enough and looking around, that's most of us. That's like taking your ad out of the yellow pages. And how are you going to get, so we've let this stuff get uncritically entwined into our lives. And I'm just trying to highlight the fact that we have.
But to go back to Trevor's point about the legislation against misinformation, what protection is there for misinformation from the government? Because according to the government, anything that disagrees with the government is misinformation.
I was actually surprised there are some policies and standards that countries like Australia have signed up to. There's OECD policies, there's European policies, there's anybody who wants to do Europe business with Europe needs to the DPRGDM. Anyway, it's all their right to be forgotten, the right to your own information, all that sort of stuff, right? So it turns out that there are laws and policies that actually can be used. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know how effectively they could be brought, but there's a lot more that exists than I thought would exist. I don't know. Does that help answer the question? I know it's not a full answer.
I'm not sure that does. Never mind.
Well, it's a bit like the recent case where they more or less proved there was a place in Russia that was the culprit with compromising a lot of data in Australia. But having shown that, what do you do once you say, well, it's someone in another country that's breaking the law?
I think the laws they're talking about are only to apply to people here. I mean, we know that dishonesty happens, but they at least want to say when it happens here, under certain criteria, it's prosecutable.
Yeah. So okay. So leaving out the bad actors thing, Trevor, right? I think it's interesting to look the fact that it was the previous government who had a bit of a stoush with and I'll make this apolitical because I have some very I have some committed thoughts on this, but they basically said to the social media companies, you need to actually pay for the news content generated in Australia. And I thought we might lose that. In fact, was it Facebook shut down or Twitter shut down in Australia for a few days? So they had no news content in Australia. They basically, but then eventually it was interesting. The social media companies, probably because there was going to be precedent for Europe and other places, not because Australia's that much of their market, but they actually started paying something for our news content. That was interesting to me. And maybe that gives you a little bit of a prototype of what can be done. I don't know.
Thanks.
Anyway, have I interested people to go and check it out and think more about this and think maybe a little bit apologetically for how the questions raised by ChatGPT can maybe be used to show that man is not the measure of all things?
Okay, are there any more comments or questions?
I have a theological one, but I think I'll leave it for the next session.
Okay. All right then. Thank you very much, Tom, for your talk and for fielding the questions and everybody's contribution. So at this point, I will end the recording, but you can hang on to have further discussion.